Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to philosophy class. Today we deal with Book 8 of the Republic. At Book 8, Socrates finally gets back to where he wanted to be at the end of Book 4. You remember that at the end of Book 4, he had gotten to the point where he thought he had described the best regime, and he was ready to go on and describe the 4 corrupted regimes. But he was interrupted at the beginning of Book 5. And it was at the beginning of Book 5 that he was essentially forced into explaining what he meant by the guardians having no privacy and no private property. So in Book 5 and Book 6 and Book 7, Socrates discusses the 3 waves, but mainly he spends most of his time, certainly all of Book 6 and all of Book 7, describing the 3rd wave, that philosophers should be rulers. So at the beginning of Book 8, you will notice that there is a nice little summary that runs from the very beginning of Book 8 at 543a and just runs about a page and a half or so over to 545a, summarizing exactly where the interlocutors with Socrates have been throughout the discussion so far, and where it seems now that they are in fact ready to go. He's ready to explain, he says, the other 4 regimes. So the first regime that's been explained in detail is what he will refer to as kingship or aristocracy, rule by the best. The next regime is going to be rule by the honored, also known as timocracy. The 3rd regime is going to be known as oligarchy, and that is ruled by those with property or money. The 4th regime is going to be ruled by the many, and that is going to be called democracy. And the last and lowest and most corrupt regime is tyranny, and that is the very opposite of the first. Instead of being ruled by the best, it's rule by the worst. So if you notice in Book 8, what we do is we skip from 545a all the way to 557a. And at this point, Socrates is beginning to discuss in more detail what democracy is all about. And he notes several things, and I encourage you to read this section from 557a to 569c, which is the end of Book 8. I encourage you to read this section very carefully. And notice that Socrates here, and Plato as well, does not seem to be a very big fan of democracy. As one person I know put it, it was conceived by Plato as rule by guys in the cheap seats. So it's rule by the many, rule by the majority, rule by what most people want. How does democracy come about, Socrates asks. It comes about when people begin to arrange their lives in whatever way pleases them. Instead of paying attention to character, instead of paying attention to what's best, they simply do whatever it is that they want. It is sort of like a supermarket. It is sort of like a cafeteria. It's sort of like picking and choosing. Well, in the democracy, it's not just that people do whatever they want, but sometimes people want to force others to do what they, those who are doing whatever they want them to do. And so there becomes divisions, there becomes factions, there become all kinds of divisiveness in society. And so the whole idea of the person as consisting of reason and the will and the appetites gets focused solely and almost completely on the appetites. Now, each constitution is a corruption of the previous one. So the first, democracy, while not really bad, is a corruption of the best, which was kingship or aristocracy. Then you get to the next one, oligarchy, ruled by money or property, was a corruption of democracy, ruled by the honored. And then democracy is a corruption of oligarchy. And so this is what Socrates is focusing on in these last pages of Book 8. How does, as he calls it, the democrat, small d democrat, how does the democrat develop from the oligarch? And particularly at 559d, Socrates describes most specifically how that takes place. One of the characteristic elements, Socrates notes, of democracy is that there begins to be a control of language, a control of what words mean, a change in meaning of words. And those of you who may have read George Orwell's 1984 will find similar points here that Socrates is making with regard to what you saw happening in the novel 1984. So, for example, at 560e, Socrates says, they return arrogance, anarchy, extravagance, and shamelessness from exile. So people begin to do things that were otherwise in the other three regimes considered to be shameful. They return shamelessness from exile. And they praise themselves for doing this. They give themselves fine names, he says. Now they call arrogance good breeding. Now they call anarchy freedom. Now they call extravagance magnificence. And now they call shamelessness courage. And you can think of your own contemporary examples wherein actions which are shameful have been called courageous. Socrates goes on in the following sections, 561, 562, and notes that one of the characteristics of democracy is that of legal equality. So the focus now becomes on the definition that Thrasymachus gave much earlier as justice being the advantage of the stronger. And if you remember, when Glaucon represented the argument of Thrasymachus at the beginning of Book 2, he noted that ultimately it is going to be the law which defines what is just. Well, if that's true, then legal equality is going to be most important. At around 562, Socrates begins to notice that democracy is now going to fade into tyranny. And democracy does this because it seems to have, as he says around 562 B and C, an insatiable desire for what it defines as the good. And this insatiable desire that democracy has for what it defines as the good is also what destroys it. If you note, in most democratic societies, and ours is no different, and we can't take everything that Socrates and Plato are saying here literally, but you notice that in democratic societies, we prize freedom very highly. Freedom is the most important thing for us. And Socrates notes this at 562c. Freedom, he says, in the democratic city is what you would hear described as its finest possession. Well, it's not too long of a step, Socrates says, from the exercise of complete freedom, complete licentiousness, into dictatorship. And this is what Socrates begins to describe here at the beginning of Book 8. For example, I encourage you to read very carefully the little section at 563a, where Socrates discusses the relationships between parents and children. It's a very interesting section. At 564a, Socrates makes an important observation for us. Extreme freedom, he says, cannot lead to anything but a change to extreme slavery. It might seem like a contradiction, but in actuality, we can become enslaved to those actions which we first engaged in freely. And this is, of course, the problem that Socrates sees as democracy begins to become more completely corrupted and then becomes what is known as tyranny. For example, you notice at 566a, one of the characteristics of the tyrant. He banishes and kills and drops hints about the cancellation of debts and the redistribution of land. Socrates notices that while freedom ultimately leads to this, there is an element of freedom still which must be maintained. What does the tyrant do after people begin to maybe notice that he is acting in a tyrannical sense? As Socrates notes at 566e, he meets them with a smile. He denies that he is a tyrant. He promises all sorts of things in public and in private. He promises to free the people from debt, to redistribute the land to them and to his followers. And all the while, Socrates says, he pretends to be gracious and gentle to all. So this is the picture that Socrates is painting here towards the end of Book 8 of the tyrant. Notice what he says at 569c. And so the people, by trying to avoid the proverbial frying pan of enslavement to free men, have fallen into the fire of having slaves as their masters. Well, in Book 9, we see more of where the life of the tyrant will lead, and we will see the conclusion of our study of the Republic.